Hello, everybody. Welcome back to AP World History. I don't remember what chapter this is. This is chapter 3 of Unit 2, and we're going to continue talking about the Mongols today. The Mongols are a major force in Eurasia in the period between 1200 and 1450. And last time, we looked at the rise of the Mongols. We looked at the start of the Mongol Empire. We looked at kind of broad effects that they would have on the Silk Road. But we're going to kind of look more specifically at the impact of the Mongols in Eastern Europe, in the case of the Golden Horde, and in the Middle East, in the Ilkhanate. So, Bellwork on the screen. Yes, today is going to be continuing topic 2.2. We're going to look at the relationship between the Muslim world and the Mongols. And something you should pay attention to today, especially when we get to the Ilkhanate, is how does the Islamic world impact Mongol culture, and how does Mongol culture impact the Islamic world? That's what you should look at. But also, you should also, and related to this is kind of the lesson objective that the College Board wants you to understand, is being able to explain the significance of the Mongol Empire in terms of continuity, in terms of what the Mongols are keeping the same across Eurasia and what they are changing across Eurasia. So again, kind of pay attention to examples of continuity and change. The biggest continuity of all is going to be that local government, for the most part, stays the same under the Mongols. So before we look at the Middle East, we've got to first look at kind of examples of continuity and change in Eastern Europe. So we're going to take a look at the Mongol presence in Eastern Europe, what historians will refer to as the Golden Horde. So where does the Golden Horde come from? Well, the Golden Horde is going to be one of the several khanates, one of the four khanates that emerges really after Genghis's death, after Genghis Khan's death in 1227 CE. But as we remember, after Genghis's death, his descendants, they're the ones who are going to expand the influence, the empire of the Mongols. And one of the areas that the Mongols will expand to, and their westernmost expansion, is going to be into Eastern Europe. And we see that actually with the invasion of the Kievan Rus. The Kievan Rus, remember, was a highly centralized Eastern European society under the direction of the city of Kiev. And we are going to see that this invasion is led by one of Genghis Khan's descendants, a guy by the name of Batu. I can't remember if he's a grandson or a son. Genghis Khan had so many gosh dang children, and it doesn't matter, quite frankly. But what does matter is that the invasion of the Mongols will lead to the decline of the Kievan Rus. The Kievan Rus is going to become very decentralized after it is invaded, after it is destroyed by these Mongol invaders. So before kind of the Mongols even got there, the Kievan Rus was politically weakened. There were a series of succession disputes between claimants to the throne of the Kievan Rus. And kind of because of this political fragmentation, that's why the Mongols were so easily conquering this territory. And really, that information's not all that important in your kind of bigger context of all of this stuff. We see that the Mongols, their victory comes as a result of the Battle of Kalka River. It's not that important. So this is kind of just describing the end of the Kievan Rus, fragmentation, eventual invasion by the Mongols, and that the Mongols do make a presence in Eastern Europe. But more importantly today is kind of how do we see both continuity and change in terms of Mongol administration? Well, let's take a look at that. Because much like other societies the Mongols rule over in Eurasia, local day-to-day government is left to locals, to local nobles, to local prominent elites. And Eastern Europe is no exception to that. And kind of how the Mongols direct this is going to be rather interesting. The Mongols essentially are going to let local rulers stay the same, that's fine, But in terms of the Eastern European societies, the Mongols are going to elect, they are going to pick out essentially a chief tax collector. And that chief tax collector is the Grand Prince. And the first one that will happen, the first one the Mongols will pick out is this Jesus looking guy, Alexander Nevsky. Nevsky is a Russian prince, a Russian noble, who the Mongols are going to pick out as the Grand Prince of the city of Moscow, also at this point called the city of Muscovy. So Nevsky is going to be this Russian prince. He's put in charge, and the job essentially he has to do is collect tribute. He's a fancy tax collector, essentially. So he is going to initially come from a city called Novgorod. It doesn't really matter. But eventually he will make his political and economic base the city of Moscow. So Nevsky controls the city of Moscow. And the city of Moscow is where all of this tribute is being collected before it's sent off to the Mongols, essentially. So the Mongols are entrusting the Grand Prince in Moscow with a lot of economic and political responsibility. They're responsible for collecting taxes. But if city-states, if Russian city-states can't pay their taxes, guess what Moscow gets to do? Well, Moscow gets to take over that city-state. So we are actually going to see that under the Mongols, that this power is entrusted to these noble officials, these officials like the Grand Prince, and as such, there's a lot of local power. And this local power is not only a demonstration of continuity, but it's also going to be a major reason why Mongol rule over Eastern Europe in specific will decline. Because as we're going to see later, Moscow is going to assume a lot of power and break away from Eastern Europe. Well, from the Mongols, I guess is what I meant to say. So let's look at other areas of both continuity and change in terms of the Mongol administration. Well, in terms of continuity, the Russian Orthodox Church remains in power. There might not be a centralized state, a centralized monarchy, but the centralized religious authority of the Orthodox Church remains. Remember, the Mongols, very religiously tolerant. But we're also going to see that something is changing in terms of Russia's connection to Central Asia and to the Middle East. Because the Mongols are going to largely cut off trade relations with, say, the Byzantines. So the Byzantines are no longer going to be the major trading partner of Russian societies. Instead, under the Mongols, it's going to be Eurasia as a whole and the Middle East. So Russia is going to become connected to wider patterns of trade during this time. Russia is exporting goods like amber and honey and timber, and it's getting all of the stuff you can get from the Middle East that I've talked about before in the Silk Road presentation. So Russia is going to become connected to outside trading influences. But notably, it's going to be cut off from the Byzantines and from Western Europe. So that's a big kind of change in this time period, is who exactly the Russians are trading with. But another big change that will be introduced during the Mongol rule we were talking about China earlier, in Mongol rule in Russia is going to be the rise of serfdom. So serfdom is going to largely develop and be introduced into Eastern Europe under the rule of the Mongols. So let's look at kind of the development of serfdom a little bit, because this is a big contrast with Western Europe. Western Europe had serfdom earlier, to put it simply. They had it early as kind of the end of the Roman Empire, but also kind of Eastern Europe is going to be later to accept serfdom, to adopt it, and it'll also be later to get rid of it as well. But how is it emerging there? Well, for one thing, we do see a lot of political fragmentation, meaning a lot of political decentralization in Eastern Europe. With the absence of a centralized king, we do see the rise of Russian aristocrats. And these Russian aristocrats, they're called boyars. So generally, when you see a society with powerful landowners, with powerful aristocratic landowners, they tend to favor serfdom. They want serfs to work the land that the nobles own. But the serfdom kind of idea in Eastern Europe is going to emerge largely because peasants are seeking protection from the Mongols, not only in terms of when the Mongols invaded, but also in terms of protection from the tribute system. So, in order to kind of reduce the obligation that the peasants have to pay to the Mongols, they're going to say, okay, nobles, you do all this stuff for us. We will work your fields, your land, if you agree to pay this tribute for us to the Mongols. So out of this kind of desire for protection, and exactly you don't need the exact knowledge exactly why serfdom emerges per se, but because there is this demand for protection from the Mongols, from this kind of very high tribute system, from the overall invasion, we will see that serfs, or peasants, I should say, gradually enter into feudal relationships with nobles, with boyars in Eastern Europe. So serfdom is going to be an influence in Russian history for quite some time. It will kind of initially appear during Mongol rule in Russia, and it's going to be kind of slowly gotten rid of. Serfdom is going to stick around in Russia until the 1860s. And that's different from Western Europe. Western Europe's largely going to get rid of serfdom by the 1600s or so. A little bit later than that, technically, but that's generally when it starts to go away and be replaced by wage labor. And that's different from serfdom, just as a point of reference. So remember kind of serfdom, the predominant form of labor in medieval Western Europe, and it's going to be a major labor form in Eastern Europe during the early modern period, the period between the 1200s basically and 1860s. So another kind of hallmark of the Russian states under the Mongol rule is the fact that Russia is going to be culturally isolated from Western Europe. Remember, the Mongols want all of this trade to go to themselves, to Central Europe, to Central Asia. So we are going to see that largely Russia will become isolated from Western Europe under the Mongol rule. And that's going to kind of lead to a further cultural difference between East and West Europe. There is going to be limited contact with the West during a time when the West is getting pretty culturally advanced, to use kind of very basic terms. And that is the time of the Renaissance. Russia is largely not going to experience that because of the influence, because of the lack of trade and outside connection with Western Europe under the Mongols. So I would watch this video right here to kind of clarify that point. It's John Green's Russia, talking kind of about the Kievan Rus and about the Mongols a little bit. And then skip to about 320.
The thought bubble. The Mongols did.
Stop.
The thought bubble.
Stop.
The Mongols did.
So the Mongols in Russia are going to go away. And I use Russia as a broad kind of form for Eastern Europe. It's technically not right, but it's right for our purposes. The Mongols are going to decline, obviously. And in general, kind of what you should pay attention to is similarities in how they decline. And I'm just going to say it off the bat. A major similarity in how all of these khanates decline is that these khanates are extremely decentralized. Remember, the Mongols, they promote continuity by having local administrators stay the same. And as such, a lot of power will be delegated to local officials, namely, in the case of Russia, the princes, the grand princes of Moscow, or Muscovy, as it was called back then. So a lot of power was given to the Russian nobles under the Mongol rule. And these Russian princes, what if they decide to say, I don't want to be a tribute state to the Mongols? So naturally, we will see kind of the Muscovites. They are rising in political and economic independence from the Mongols. Eventually, we will see kind of the Russian nobles under the leadership of the state of Moscow, of the city-state of Moscow, that they will kind of beat the Mongols at the Battle of Kulikovo. And this is going to start a process in which the Mongols steadily start retreating away from Eastern Europe back to Central Asia. But we're also going to kind of see that one of the big impacts of the Mongols in general in in Eurasian history is that the Mongols will indirectly and directly lead to the creation of new states. So a lot of power was given to Moscow. Moscow eventually will raise its own army, drive away the Mongols. And one of the big states that will emerge is going to be the city-state of Moscow. Moscow is going to gradually expand during the Mongol rule over Russia. We will see kind of Moscow absorbing those tribute states that couldn't pay for the Mongol tribute. And then eventually we will see a guy by the name of Ivan III. He's going to declare himself Tsar or Emperor of all of Russian-speaking people. So we can trace the origins of the Russian Empire, what we'll discuss more in Unit 3, to this resistance against the Mongols. But we also see that other states will break away from the Golden Horde, namely Lithuania, Serbia. They're also examples of that. So kind of the Mongols, in how they give a lot of power to local administrators, that's a major reason why the Mongols will eventually collapse in general, but why they're going to decline in Eastern Europe specifically. So you should be able to describe kind of society under the Golden Horde, and you should also be able to identify and describe how the Golden Horde collapsed. How did it go away? Hello.
I'm going through my bookshelf and finding a whole bunch of books that I don't know why I didn't just put out for the kids to pick.
Mm-hmm.
And I have a few world books. Do you want them?
Oh, sure. Yeah. All right. So barring that, we are going to see that the Mongols, I don't want to cut this video. The Mongols are going to have a presence in the Middle East as well. And we call the Mongol Khanate in the Middle East the Ilkhanate, the Ilkhanate. I mispronounce it all the time. I mispronounce things. It's a fact of life. It's only natural. Looking at you, John Adams. All right. So let's take a look at the origins of the Mongol presence in the Middle East. Well, to kind of speed things through a little bit, the Mongols initially will invade the Middle East because of one of Genghis Khan's grandsons, a guy by the name of Hulagu. Hulagu is going to invade the Abbasid Caliphate. By the 1250s, he's going to burn down the city of Baghdad. The city of Baghdad, remember, that was the center of the Abbasid Caliphate. It was also, thank you, the kind of Islamic cultural capital of the Islamic Golden Age. Thank you so much.
I also have People's History of the United States.
Ooh, I love that book.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. Anyway, so the destruction of Baghdad is going to be kind of a side effect, you could say, of the Mongol invasion of the Middle East. And it's a huge controversy in Middle Eastern history, and we'll talk about it more in just a second. But we do have this destruction of Baghdad. The Mongols, they're not going to invade North Africa because of this battle right here. It doesn't really matter all that much, but it's kind of helping explain why they're limited to the Middle East, why they're limited to only Eurasia. So we do see kind of the initial invasion of the Middle East of the Abbasid Caliphate by the Mongols. That leads to the decline of the Abbasid Caliphate, and that's basically all that you need to know from this. But kind of what you do need to know is how the Mongols will interact with, say, the Muslim world. So kind of it's important to understand that while the Mongols are generally religiously tolerant, and that is very much true under the Ilkhanate, initially there is a bit of a tense relationship. And we see that expressed in a variety of different ways. The Mongols, before they get to the Middle East, largely not Muslim. Largely they are Buddhist. And these Buddhists, they worship at idols. And that is contrary to the iconoclastic vision of strict monotheism in the Muslim world. So there's religious tension initially. There's also differences in diets, kind of the Mongols, true to form, they're more kind of all about eating kind of meat with blood still in it a little bit. They don't properly drain the blood as opposed to kind of Muslim halal dietary restrictions. So there's that difference. But there's also going to be a little bit of controversy because the Mongols under Hulagu, they, killed the last Abbasid Caliphate, which remember, that's the literal successor of Muhammad. So that's going to cause a little bit of sore tensions, at least initially. We also are going to see a series of rebellions by Shia Muslims, by a secret group of hashish-taking Shia Muslims called assassins. So there will be kind of initial unrest in the Middle East because of the Mongol invasion. You could kind of say this is a counter-argument to the idea that the Mongols were religiously tolerant. But we do see that there will be kind of concessions made. The Mongols will actively try and ease relationships with the Muslims by doing a lot to change their own kind of religious practices, at least in the Middle East. So we do see actually that a lot of Mongols in the Middle East, they will convert to Islam. One of the most famous examples is Hulagu's successor, a guy by the name of Berke Khan. So Berke will convert to Islam. He will use Muslim scholars as his advisors. So we do see that the Mongols will promote continuity in that they are going to respect kind of the religious traditions of the Muslims, at least towards kind of thanks to the actions of guys like Berke. But what's going on in terms of government? Well, a lot of similarity, you could say, with the Golden Horde. For one thing, we largely do see that, like other societies that the Mongols control in Eurasia, that local administration will stay the same. So a lot of local administration, especially in the form of things like tax collecting and census taking, this will be left to previous local officials or to prominent local elites. So we are going to see that in the Ilkhanate, in order to promote, efficient trade, efficient government, that the Mongols are going to appoint scholars, especially Muslim scholars, to prominent political positions. So the Ilkhanate is going to kind of have a government made up of prominent locals who are smarty pantses. So the Mongols do appoint based on merit. They promote continuity by having the same local officials in charge. An example of that is through things like appointing census takers and tax collectors who are Muslim scholars in the Middle East. The Mongols, just as a side note, they're going to be kind of based in the city of Tabriz, which is along the Caspian Sea. That's kind of their center of power. But kind of there will be some difficulties in the Ilkhanate that will kind of sound familiar to China when I discuss that next. So we do kind of see that there will be some economic weaknesses, mostly because of very high taxes the Mongols will place on merchants. And that's not going to be not on merchants, on peasants. So we will kind of see a discouragement of agricultural activity because of these rather high taxes that the Mongols have. But another big problem that the Mongols have in the Middle East and in China, as we'll see later, is inflation. The Mongols prefer to use paper money. That's a technology diffusing into the Middle East because of the Mongols. So we are going to see inflation occur under the Ilkhanate, and that is going to cause, arguably, the decline of the Ilkhanate, leading to its fragmentation, leading to new empires. Let's first take a look at culture very quickly. Well, for one thing, we are going to see that the Mongols, active promoters of culture in the Middle East during the Ilkhanate. We are going to see that the government of the Ilkhanate, that they are actively promoting and sponsoring scientific and artistic developments. And we're also going to see kind of changes to local culture in a way. We are seeing kind of the bringing in of Chinese scholarship, of Chinese forms of artistic expression. So we do kind of see changes in Middle Eastern, specifically Persian culture under the Ilkhanate. So the Mongols are allowing for the diffusion of Chinese culture, of Chinese philosophy, Chinese science. That's going to blend with Persian influences, with Islamic Muslim influences. And we see that actually in this image right here. This is a Persian miniature portrait, miniature painting. It depicts Mongols who are studying the Quran. The Quran is kind of typically in this kind of stand right here, this X stand right here. So it's the Mongols producing this work right here. They're depicting themselves, but it's done in a Persian style. There are Arabic words kind of thrown out throughout this painting, and one I can see is right here. So we do see kind of the Mongols promote a new type of Persian culture, one that blends together Islamic, native Persian, pre-Islamic native Persian, and Chinese influences. But we're also going to see kind of that in addition to how the Mongols are impacting Islamic culture in the Middle East, they're also going to allow for the spread of Islam outside of the Middle East. Remember, the Mongols unified the Silk Road. If I say that one more time, my head might explode. The Mongols are going to promote trade across the Silk Road, which leads to the spread of Islam. Islam will spread, especially into Central Asia, thanks to this increased Silk Road protection the Mongols are offering. And if you ever kind of see kind of as a form of reference, if you ever see kind of the mention of Sufis, associate that with missionary presence. Sufis, Islamic mystics, who will oftentimes take missionary roles. And we are actually going to see kind of under the Ilkhanate a continuation of the Islamic Golden Age. The government of the Ilkhanate is contributing to Islamic culture by sponsoring scientists and artists. And we see that kind of in terms of scholarship that increases. We have the influence of Rashid al-Din. He is a historian who is going to, under the Ilkhanate, with government sponsorship, write a history of Europe and Asia, and a little bit of Africa as well. It's one of the first history books in world history. But another more important, arguably for us anyway, is that the Mongols will promote scientific development in the Middle East. And an example of that is going to be the rise of figures like Nizar al-Din Tusi. And Al-Dun is going to be a kind of example of scientific advancement under the Mongols. We see a continuation of the scientific Islamic Golden Age. And Tusi is going to be a prominent astronomer. He does a lot of things. He's a math nerd. He writes poetry. But he's going to be kind of well remembered in the West anyway because of his astronomy, because of his astronomical findings. And he's going to find that rather than the Earth being in the center of the solar system, rather than the geocentric model, we have that the sun is in the center of the solar system, the heliocentric model. And as we're going to talk about later in Unit 3, these scientific ideas, they're going to make their way eventually into Europe thanks to increased trade. And actually Copernicus, who we'll talk about later, he's some Polish nerd. I can say that, I'm Polish. He's some Polish scientist that we'll talk about later. He's actually going to base his works off of earlier Muslim scholarship, namely from guys like Nizar al-Din Tusi. So you should be able to answer this question right here about how did Islam impact the Mongols? And I'll just give you the hint right now. We see that the majority of Mongols in the Middle East, they will adopt Islam. So that's one way that the Islamic world is impacting Muslims, or that is impacting Mongols. But we're also going to see how the Mongols help facilitate advancements in the Islamic world. And that mostly is seen through the sponsorship of art and science, but also through the assistance in the spread of Islam along the Silk Road. Well, the Ilkhanate is going to go away. How sad. And it's mostly going to be because of the amount of local power given to local elites. So the very decentralized nature of the Ilkhanate is going to lead to fragmentation. What if local nobles decide to break away from this Khanate? And that's what they do. So as a kind of side note, what you should also kind of keep in the back of your mind, and this is a test question, by the way, what you should keep in the back of your mind is that even though that the Ilkhanate is so decentralized, even though we do see its breakup into several empires, culture will still continue. We will see a continuation of this Islamic golden age, even though there's a lack of a unified empire after the Ilkhanate goes away. And that's similar to northern Italy. We'll talk about that more later. But a comparison between northern Italy and the Ilkhanate, very decentralized places, lots of independent states. These independent states will contribute to cultural advancements. That's just a basic similarity. But another big impact of the decline of the Ilkhanate is that future empires will kind of descend and break away from the Ilkhanate. And one example of that is Timur. We talked about Timur very briefly with the Chagatai Empire. But Timur is a Mongol, well, a Central Asian nomad noble who is going to kind of create his own political empire out of the remains of the Ilkhanate and of the Chagatai Empire. So Timur is going to found the Timurid Empire. The Timurid Empire is merely important because other empires will come from the Timurid Empire. And one of those empires that we'll talk about later is the Mughals. The Mughals are an Islamic dynasty that will pop up in India after invasion from a Timurid noble by the name of Babur. And we'll talk about that more later, so don't get that confused right now. But another big kind of player that will emerge after the decline of the Ilkhanate is going to be the Ottomans, the Ottoman Turks. So the Turks initially were a Central Asian nomadic group. They're going to kind of be involved in the invasion of Eurasia, that Genghis Khan kind of divides up these Turkish nomads and puts them into his army. So we do see kind of that the Turks have this Central Asian nomadic origin, and they are going to follow along with the Mongols in invading the Middle East. And guess what? They're going to bring with them their horseback tradition, and they're going to settle down in a region of the world known as Anatolia, which is modern-day Turkey. And eventually, as the Ilkhanate is declining, as the writing on the wall is being spelt out for the Ilkhanate, as it's declining, we are going to see that a Turkish noble, a bey by the name of Osman, is going to found his own ruling dynasty, which will become the Ottoman Empire. And you can see a sexy picture of Osman Bey right here. He is a bey, a noble, who founds the House of Osman. I probably shouldn't have. Anyway, so Osman is going to be the first Ottoman Sultan. So we are going to start to see the rise of the Ottoman Empire as a result of the fragmentation of the Ilkhanate. So there's a huge kind of long-lasting significance of the Mongols in general, is that future empires will emerge based on their legacy. And eventually the Ottomans, they are going to kind of adopt not only horseback riding, but they're also going to adopt gunpowder from China and use that to help create their own political state. And an example of how they create their own political state is using cannons to take down the city of Constantinople, at least the walls. So 1453, the Ottomans, they are going to invade Constantinople. They'll end the Byzantine Empire. They'll start their own Islamic-style kingdom based around the city of Constantinople. And that's what Osman looked like. And I show this picture merely to kind of demonstrate the importance of artillery, of gunpowder units in helping out the Ottomans invading Constantinople. So a big legacy of the Mongols militarily is the spread of gunpowder. That's what you should remember. So you should think about this question right here. How is the Mongol Empire leading to new states in Eurasia? And what are some examples of that? So kind of think about how each of these khanates decline that we've talked about so far. Hint, hint, it's their very decentralized nature. They gave a lot of power to local nobles. These local nobles, in turn, broke away, formed their own empires. That's basically how to answer that. Try saying that 5 times fast. Anyway, I am done with this video. Have a great day. If you have any questions, drop a comment in the chat or whatever, the comment section. Criticize me all you want, talk about my hygiene. I don't know. Don't talk about that. Don't do that. Actually, don't criticize me. Well, no, I mean ask any question. I don't know. This video is over with. Have a great day. God bless. No, I shouldn't say that. Whatever. Bye.